Hello, Jacqueline Hughes Simon here in Berkeley, California, interviewing Laleh Behbehanian on the 30th of April 2012. Thank you for being here with us
Thank you for having me.
Oh, good. Where were you born?
I was actually born in Tehran, in Iran.
And where were your parents born?
They were also actually both born in Tehran. My family is all from Iran.
Are your parents here in the United States now, or are they still in Iran?
My mother is here. She's on the East Coast, and my father still lives in Tehran, and the family is kind of dispersed between the U.S., other parts of the world, and Iran.
Did your parents go to college?
They did. Both of them did. Yes, actually, and my father came to the U.S. for graduate school. So yes.
Do you live in the East Bay? Which city?
I live in Oakland. Yeah, I've lived in Oakland now for about 10 years.
You're currently a student at UC Berkeley?
I'm a graduate student. I'm a doctoral candidate. I'm working on a dissertation in the Department of Sociology at UC Berkeley.
And what is your thesis? Are you working on your dissertation yet, or?
I am, yeah. My dissertation is on, actually I work on counterterrorism practices, so U.S. counterterrorism practices. So I look at kind of the various investigative techniques and ways in which the U.S. government identifies people as potential terrorists. So things like surveillance, data mining, counterterrorism practices, essentially.
The Occupy movement emerged as a response to the financial crisis of 2008. How did that crisis affect you?
Well, I mean, in similar ways to lots of people, and I like many people, I struggle to pay my rent. Tomorrow's May 1st, and so, today as I sit here, I think about how I'm going to pay tomorrow's rent. As a graduate student, it's affected me like it has students all over this country, and definitely within the UC systems here in California, within the public education system. Because there's been, tuition increases, just gargantuan tuition increases in the past few years, and all kinds of cuts to our funding. And I, like many graduate students all over this country, make my way through graduate education by working for the public university. So I've spent the past 10 years not only working on my own degree at UC Berkeley, but also investing my labor into that public system of education and teaching undergraduates. So I've been affected both financially and, in terms of my own struggles just to kind of get by as a graduate student, which has involved waiting tables and, bartending and all kinds of things like that to make ends meet. While you grade papers and try and give students a top-notch education. But it's affected us in the classrooms, because it becomes more and more difficult to actually, ensure that any kind of decent education gets to students who are, signing away the rest of their lives in debt, and so are their families. And all the kinds of strains in the system with budget cuts and everything. So, you feel it both as a wage worker within the university, but also as you try and actually ensure that the students get an education.
Occupy Wall Street started in New York in September of 2011. Is that when you became aware of it?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's like people all over the country and all over the world when I became aware of it. And increasingly excited by it. And at the time, of course, also just kind of following things going on in other parts of the world at the same time. But for us in Oakland, it was October 10th. It was shortly after that. It was October 10th that we first established our camp and Occupy Oakland, what's come to be called the Oakland Commune. So that was when I first began to start to get involved. But I have to say that, in those first couple of weeks, I went out there a few times, but it was actually October 25th, the first day of the police raid, where my involvement became much more kind of intense and daily and all-encompassing.
Now, Oakland has been a major focal point of the Occupy movement. Why Oakland?
Why do I think that Oakland has become a major focus? Well, I think that obviously, this in the U.S. began in New York, with this, emphasis on these economic issues and this really bold and courageous kind of physical occupation of Wall Street, and this, critique about the power of corporations and the 1% in kind of controlling our political system, etc. And I think that spread. But I think, like any strong movement, as soon as a movement starts to have any impact, undoubtedly there's going to be forms of repression that kind of come back. And I think that Oakland was one of the places where that repression of the Occupy movement showed its face most kind of brutally, and most visibly, most internationally, within hours. And so I think that that's what kind of put Oakland at the forefront. And then, in part, it's not just the repression that came from the city of Oakland, it's also that in Oakland, I think relative to many other parts of the Occupy movement, Oakland is much more diverse in terms of race and kind of ethnicity and class and sexuality and all kinds of things. But it's, it's an Occupy movement that's emerging within a context that has long struggles around police brutality, police repression, kind of the violence of the state, right? And so I think that whereas the violence of the economy was this central issue that New York put, on the, within public debate, Oakland really brought this issue of the violence that accompanies that kind of really brutally unfair economy. You can't keep down a 99% without some really extreme forms of force. And I think that that's become one of the things that's become a central issue that Oakland has continued to put, at the forefront of these discussions.
So what I hear you saying is that you feel the reaction of the state is what helped to focus the eyes of the world and to help focus the Occupy movement? Not that it was reactive, but that it helped to focus everyone.
Well, yes, I think it kind of pushed it to, the reality of what the struggle was actually going to be, because, in those weeks and in the weeks that followed, Occupies all over this country faced really, in often cases, quite violent forms of being displaced out of their camps through all kinds of use of force. In Oakland, in a city where the police department has a long history and the connections and collusion between the police department and the mayor's office has a long history of kind of being quite rogue and quite brutal and outside of the law. That kind of showed its face most visibly. But I think that within Oakland, people were also ready to organize around that because that had been an issue. And so, in Oakland, there's no, you can't talk about economic issues without talking about issues of violence and repression at the same time, because for many, communities of color around this country, for many poor communities, that's a huge part of poverty, about the experience of poverty, right? Having police in your neighborhoods, and having the kind of those really impoverished parts of our country being policed in those kinds of ways. So,
this might be redundant at this part. Our mutual friend gave me your name as someone who has been very involved with Occupy. Do you see yourself as a committed activist?
Yes, absolutely. I see myself as an activist in the sense that I think Occupy has empowered many of us. It's provided us opportunities of ways to act politically that are new and creative and outside of the box. And so I think all kinds of people all over the country have found themselves in the past 6 months to be activists. And committed, definitely, because in my life, I have never witnessed anything in this country as worthy of being committed to. And it has its problems, and it has all kinds of, it's complicated and it's not easy and it's challenging and it's not always pretty, but it's the best thing I've seen, the best possibility I've ever seen.
There has been a criticism that Occupy has no message. Do you agree with that criticism?
Absolutely not. I think that, that criticism itself is what we need to be critical of. We're living in a time and in a culture where everything political is simplified, in these real easy kind of cotton candy media spectacular versions of the story. Everything is simplified into these black and white kind of, one-liners. And That's not the nature of politics. And we have to, have less kind of patience with those kinds of ways of understanding politics. So when, mainstream media sits there and again criticizes the Occupy movement for not being organized, that in fact is actually, it's new forms of organization that are very different than the traditional mainstream lobbying political organizing that this country has seen. In terms of not having clear demands, the fact is that it's not one demand. This isn't a lobby where there's, it's some kind of political action committee of corporations that are organized around one demand. This is about all of the demands of the 99%, which are varied because the issues that people face are varied. What's important is that all of these people with these various demands recognize that addressing their demands can only be addressed through the same source, addressing fundamentally transforming the economic and political system in this country. And that's what's empowering about this movement, that people who have labor concerns, people who have concerns around education, people who have concerns around health care, are actually coming together and recognizing ways to work together to address that.
The general meetings are sometimes described as chaotic, a messy display of grassroots democracy. How would you describe a general meeting?
They're absolutely chaotic and they're absolutely messy, but they're also beautiful. And, so general assemblies, aside from, let's say the decisions that are made out of them, or that the way we may judge their efficacy, in these kind of very rational terms, aside from that, we have to recognize them as they're places where Americans, and we have very little kind of real experience in democracy and real democracy, are practicing, hands-on, or practicing democracy in ways that require consensus with each other, actual real public debate, doing it in really visible ways that are accessible to anyone walking down the street. And of course, and that are really kind of really open and diverse. So of course, when you're sitting there trying to have conversations between, people who are coming to represent certain labor unions and, homeless communities and youth, and of course those conversations get messy, but they're so amazing and they rarely happen. And so to me, the General Assemblies have been one of the most extraordinary things, aside from the decisions that get made and the ports that get shut down and the general strikes that get organized. Thousands and thousands of people across this country have come into their public spaces and in what I believe the true spirit of kind of American democracy started to reclaim their democratic habits.
The backlash to Occupy emerged quickly and strongly. Can you talk about who was involved in that?
Who was involved in the backlash? Absolutely. That varies, obviously, to some extent from city to city. In the city of Oakland, it absolutely has involved, and it continues to involve, all kinds of collusion between the mayor's office and the city administration, the Oakland Police Department, a range of local kind of law enforcement agencies, and the district attorney's department, the district attorney's office. So we could probably map that out in different locations, but across the country, all of that, to some extent, is becoming clearer and clearer as being coordinated at a federal level. The forces involved in that, they range from, your local police officers on the ground in any city all the way up to Homeland Security. And then I think if you push a little bit farther behind that, and this is the message of Occupy in general, is behind all of those puppets are certain corporate interests that, are ensuring that a huge amount of public resources are being allocated to actually repressing the public.
There will be a May Day protest in Oakland. Who will be involved? Sorry.
Yeah, so that's tomorrow.
Yeah.
Everybody, hopefully, everybody. Here in the Bay Area, both Oakland, San Francisco, also Berkeley, there's definitely all kinds of labor will be out there, of course, right? It's May Day, so the unions will be out in full force. The Occupy movement has been, mobilizing and organizing around this. So both Occupy Oakland, Occupy SF. And there's, all kinds of organizations and NGOs, but there's just also lots of autonomous organizing through, small groups of people doing all kinds of autonomous actions. So, our plan is, for tomorrow morning, beginning at 8 a.m., there are plans for these kind of mobile strike marches all throughout downtown Oakland to shut down the major banks, to shut down major redevelopment agencies that have played a role in specifically in various kind of gentrifying redevelopment projects in Oakland. There's an action that is picketing CPS, Child Protective Services, that's being led by Occupy Oakland's Occupy Patriarchy. So basically it's an all-out day of really, attacking all of the kind of corporate and state institutions that we're targeting.
Well, you did, might I read you something, because I picked this up yesterday in downtown Oakland. It's defend CPS from the Occupy molesters. The entire Occupy movement is administered top-down by a criminal organization called the Mara Sarvucha, aka MS-13, who molest children. This is why they never have real democratic meetings, and this is why they are calling for a May Day action against Child Protective Services. There's a little more. You talked about the patriarchy, but the counter demonstration is called for 8:30 at 14th and Broadway. Who is behind this?
I have no idea, and it's so ridiculous. It's almost not even worth any response. But I mean, those kinds of flyers show up here and there, and if anything, I would imagine tomorrow in front of CPS you might find 2 or 3, people off across the street. But I definitely, that's not something that I would be worried about. I think what's important is, I think actually it's a really that CPS action tomorrow is actually really crucial because it's being organized by Occupy Patriarchy, and one of the really crucial points being made there is that this economic system and the system of repression that accompanies it, that we are recognizing as being problematic, is also in many ways, it's violence and is in many ways gendered and sexualized and targets families in particular ways, and CPS is part of a larger kind of criminal justice system that criminalizes certain poor parents over particular behaviors and has an enormous amount of power in poor families and families of color, and somehow is seen as taking the welfare and taking responsibility for the welfare of children, and is failing to do so in so many cases, and is causing so much violence to so many families. And so I think it's really important that issues of patriarchy are really brought to the forefront when we think about all of this. Yeah.
Last fall, we saw strong demonstrations with a strong police response. What was your reaction to violence at these demonstrations?
What was my reaction to the violence of the police in these times?
Any violence.
Okay.
Any violence. Yeah.
Well, my reaction, I was there on, October 25th on the day of the first raid and the kind of infamous tear gassing and all of that. I was there on a couple weeks later on the second raid, and and throughout these months in countless cases of these police operations of rubber bullets and police projectiles and flashbang grenades and etc. And on one hand, intellectually I can't say I'm surprised, because of course that's going to be the response ultimately. But I guess in a kind of naive American way of somebody who has I had the privilege of my mother being able to get us out of Iran at a time where Iran was a really violent place. And so, I've been one of the lucky people in this world that was able to come to the U.S. and live more or less a life that had the privilege of being buffered from violence. And so, what I've experienced definitely in the past 6 months in Oakland, in some ways it reminds me of, I spent, years living in Egypt and in parts of the Middle East. In some ways it reminds me of, walking through the streets of Mubarak's, Cairo, like, men with, AK-47s and huge formations of police and just this heavily militarized, public space. And so, while I'm not surprised, there is, it's shocking. Somehow it's so shocking to walk through the streets of Oakland and walk through tear gas and on a regular basis be confronted with formations of hundreds of police officers. And for us, that didn't stop in November. That's continued on an almost weekly basis every time there's a major action. And that's what we all brace ourselves for tomorrow, because there's no doubt that as attempts are made to shut down banks and picket federal and state institutions, that we're going to face that once again.
There are many things wrong with our country right now. What are your concerns?
Oh God, a lot. Definitely, the economic, I think that economically people are being squeezed harder and harder and harder. And as that happens, you see more and more desperation. I think we're going to see more and more violence. It's really impossible for, as the world continues to get kind of more and more imbalance between the have and the have-nots, it's inevitable that the world also becomes increasingly violent. So in that sense, I see a future definitely of unrest, but I'm hopeful in the sense that I also see people all over the world really courageously standing up. I see it in Oakland. I see, as tear gas was launched at us, I watched, my fellow Oaklanders, all of us just walk right back and get right back into, and march right back to the plaza. And we've watched this all over the world. And so I also have a sense of hope, and I have a sense of faith in the power of people, because, as sophisticated and powerful as the weapons of the 1% are, nothing can really compare to the power of people really just taking over their streets, their communities. And I think we're going to see a glimpse of that tomorrow all over the world.
We're having the presidential elections in November. Do you see Occupy helping or hurting Obama's re-election efforts?
Well, I think, when we talk about Occupy, it's always important to, Occupy is a really decentralized, really diverse kind of movement with all kinds of people who have very different political positions, radically different, from kind of leftists, liberals to, much more radical anarchists, right? And so I think there's some people within Occupy that believe in the importance of continuing to work within kind of electoral politics and affecting change there. And so I think that there will be people within Occupy who are working around the elections, and presumably, of course, they're going to be, supporting Obama, right? And I think that there's many other people that are just disillusioned with that. And I think that that's a big part of the actual birth of Occupy in the first place. I think that the first, election of Obama for many people was a really kind of amazing moment that held the hope that change was really kind of coming. And as, business went back to usual in Washington and in Wall Street, I think a lot of people became really disillusioned. And the idea that, we could get a man like Barack Obama into the White House and still everything remains the same, I think is what pushed many people into the streets, and many people to really be disillusioned with that form of politics. And so I think there's going to be many people that are not going to be so concerned with the election. But I think that Occupy has impacted not necessarily so much Obama's, chances of being reelected, but more importantly, it's completely reshaped the debate. It's pushed Obama, it's pushed the left, it's pushed the Democrats to actually have to start at least speaking to these economic concerns. It's pushed the whole nation in that direction. I mean, it's the first time I've ever really known Americans to speak in terms of class, even if it is kind of covered in the language of 1%, 99%, and we don't talk about capitalists and the working class. It's still, you know, and that to me is extraordinary. And that's one of the outcomes of Occupy. So I think that what's important about Occupy and these forms of movements, and historically I think this has always been the case, is these forms of really, you know, these popular movements, these grassroots popular movements that actually push mainstream political parties into any kind of progressive direction, right? You know, it's not that the Democratic Party in and of itself is going to come up with some solution. If we push them farther and farther to the left to actually address social issues, then that will shape the elections. You know?
What I hear you saying is that Occupy is a people's movement and that it is essential to move the debate forward. How could you see someone becoming involved? What could be a step for someone to become involved?
In Occupy. Well, there I think, you know, the General Assemblies are one really wonderful way. And despite the fact that, you know, actually that flyer calling, you know, occupiers child molesters or whatever it was, you know, made the claim of, you know, that's why they don't hold open meetings. I think actually that's, in fact, the most crucial thing about Occupy is the kind of openness and transparency of these General Assemblies that are always held in kind of public spaces, are open to all. And the thing to keep in mind is, you know, it's not like, they're not meetings where you have to go in and you're going to be accounted for and you have to sit through. You know, they're usually held in some kind of public space and you can just kind of drop in and stand back and just watch, you know, and there's no kind of commitment required for that. And just see the people in your neighborhood. What are they talking about? What are the issues that are concerning them? And I think that, you know, so just come out into General Assemblies. The other thing is, you know, Occupies all over the country are constantly doing different kinds of actions. And so one way is to actually get involved in the specific kind of actions that interest you. If public education is what your interest is, just start looking into what Occupy is doing in your neighborhood around that. And of course, you know, and I hate to say this, but the internet is always, you know, Google.
Oh, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Is there anything else that you feel burning that you'd like to add to this conversation?
No, I mean, I would want to thank you all for doing this, because I think that this kind of project is exactly the kind of historical archiving that goes with this kind of movement, you know, letting people speak about their perspectives. And it's supposed to be a leaderless movement, and we're all leaders and we're all representatives, and so really like understanding what this whole Occupy thing has been about, I think really requires us getting down all kinds of voices. And so thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is Jackie Simon, and thanking Laleh Behbehanian, correct?
Yes.
For being with us this 30th April 2012. Thank you.